We're going to get going here. Welcome back from lunch. I want to introduce you to our talk here from DreamWorks. I'm going to pull up the hardest part of this talk is going to be sharing this out. Hopefully you guys can see this. We're going to be talking about the PipelineX in retrospect. And for those that have seen me talk before, you'll be very familiar with what PipelineX is. For those that don't know, I'm going to give you a quick little preview. PipelineX is a project that we've started. Wow, it's probably been, I don't want to say quite 10 years in the making, but quite some number of years close to that. A lot of people's mind share went into the production of this. It's basically an evolution of several pipelines that we've had over the 25 plus years of DreamWorks Animation of making the movies we've made. In this latest run, some of the emphasis was to rethink the way that we do our work, in that in a brave new future that I'm sure many of you are sympathetic to, a lot of our artists and creatives are distributed. So in sort of the earlier days when we were all concentrated in one location, Pipeline was somewhat more forgiving. You could sort of get away with a lot more than you can now when we want to provide good experiences to our artists that may not be geographically all in the same place. So one of the bigger goals of PipelineX is, no matter where you find yourself and no matter what particular department that you might be in, the experience should be the same as if you were sitting in a seat somewhere in our Glendale studio, and that all the tools and all the capacity and ability would still be at your disposal. And communication wise, you should have as much up-to-date information as any other person would have. So one thing that I think differentiates this pipeline from other pipelines we've had in the past is that this one is what we call more task-based. And by that, I mean, instead of being asset focused, where it's all about where are my files and what particular thing am I looking for, it's all about concentrating on, well, what is it that you in the pipeline are performing? What is your actual task, as we call them in the pipeline? And what we've done is we've drawn literally digitally a whole end-to-end specification of tasks that are performed in any given pipeline that we have, and we tie the assets to that. The ideal being that no matter what you've been assigned to do, it should be simpler for you to be able to locate the assets you need and to be able to stay in touch with the assets that flow towards you. So by that, I mean, as you are somewhere in this organic web of tasks, you have some associative things that flow towards you. When you have subscriptions to those things, what happens is you get real-time notifications to the upgrades that are available to you. And the ideal is that this doesn't just, again, work in Glendale at our home base, but you could hypothetically be anywhere in the world and receive the same sort of real-time information and have access to anything that you need. So what has also made this sort of a more unique pipeline for at least DreamWorks is that instead of working just with on-prem infrastructure, we have really, truly, or tried to embrace more cloud native approaches for how we've designed a lot of the software that we have in support of this pipeline. And so where we deploy the solution could be home. It could be in Azure Cloud, somewhere here in the States or somewhere anywhere else in the world. And again, ideally, your experience having logged into whatever region of the world you happen to be in would be identical. Your access to all the goods and to be part of our task infrastructure would be the same. So I paint this picture as if it's all perfect, right? Like, if you've seen me talk before, you can tell I'm very passionate about this. I've been in this space of writing pipeline software for 27 plus years. And this one is probably the most exciting and the most ambitious I've ever been a part of. And again, I'm not going to take credit for it. There's been a lot of really smart people that have all collaborated on this and provided expertise. So what I'm going to talk through is, even though there's this perfect ideal pipeline that we have and the way that we'd want it to work, and I can come and spend, as you've seen me, hours talking about what could be and what's been nice and all the benefits of cloud and all that kind of stuff. I think it's beneficial for talks like this to get a little more real with everybody about not all the things that went perfectly, but if you watch the opening talk, a lot was revealed about how people make mistakes, and you learn from those mistakes and you grow from those mistakes. And we want to be a little more revealing about what didn't go so great and what are some hardships in building things out in these particular ways. From that, we're learning from that, but we're also hoping to help other people who are just starting their journey to maybe avoid some of the pitfalls, to have a little more awareness kind of when you're going in to try something like this. What are things, to be cautious of? And ideally, community wise, we all kind of band together and work together towards some of these things, so that if we continue to fight with some of these things and other people figure them out, they can share back. And I'm big on community. So some of the real challenges I can just quickly get into, which would be change is hard. I can talk day and night about technical things, and we will. I'm going to bring up two of our engineers, or most senior level engineers in the particular areas they're going to talk through. And what they're going to go into is, again, is more technical. What I'm going to talk about in the next couple of minutes, though, is if you're in this already, or you're about to get into this, or want to get into this, the biggest advice I can give you that still to this day, I need to respect more than maybe I do from time to time, is just the cost of change. People become very accustomed to things. And even if there are things that you think, wow, I can't believe they go through those 30 steps every day. Wouldn't it be easier if they had one? Sometimes you'd be surprised that sometimes they're fond of doing those steps because they've done them so often that they feel they can accelerate their work without any sort of change introduced, which makes change hard, because a lot of times change makes perfect sense to everyone in the organization. But to lift your organization to spiritually follow in a new direction, that can sometimes be a very, very daunting task. And it's something that we continue to go through. And I imagine we'll always have to go through to some degree. But the cost of change is very real. And it really takes the collective whole of the studio and all different parts of the organization to all kind of join together to try to encourage people to embrace change. But I don't want anyone out there to feel like, if you're excited about this and you're trying to get people to kind of come in with you on this, that it's an impossible hill to climb. Like it is very much a possible hill to climb. This is just sort of a shout out to a talk that I'm going to be involved in later. I think it starts at 4:30 to 5:30, and I'll be in the 5:30 segment where we talk about this very subject of how to get adoption for things like this and the social challenges involved. But with that said, I want to put that aside now. I want to get to what I think is probably the more exciting part of this talk, which is I'm going to introduce next Brett Schlenk, who's our principal engineer at DreamWorks Animation. He's been there along with me for quite a number of years and has been pivotal in a lot of the actual development of the services and all the technical goodness that has allowed us to have the pipeline that we have. And he's going to talk to you about some of the challenges and some of the hurdles that we've been through and try to bring more realism to what it took to build this. Following him will be Michael Ferguson. Michael Ferguson is also a very senior level engineer in the organization. He's more on the operations side. He's there to help support the services that we've built. And it's going to talk about the challenges of, it's not just about building the software that runs the pipeline. It's also about the software that runs the software and talking about all the hardships and challenges involved in the operational side of adopting a pipeline like we've built. So with that, I'm gonna ask Brett to kind of come on and join me, and I'm gonna have him talk through the development challenges, which will be followed by the platform operation challenges. So with that, I'm gonna hand it off to Brett.
Hi, I'm Brett. The first thing I'd like to say is that Michael Ferguson gets credit for this slide template. I stole it from his slide deck. So thank you, Michael. Like Doug said, we've been iterating on this for about 10 years. This sort of covers the last milestone of the most current iteration. So the idea is, hey, let's build this globally distributed platform for pipeline data. And we're gonna make it in Glendale, and we're gonna use containers and cloud native databases. And then we're gonna put it on a service provider, and it'll work exactly the same way because we're using containers and cloud native databases. Oh, and the people who are developing it are also going to be the people who are supporting it. So what could go wrong? We have lofty goals. Doug? I also borrowed this diagram and relabeled it a little bit. The whole idea is that we can do all of these things in the pipeline. We can create things. We can define what needs to be created. We can describe those things. We can have people iterate over their work. They can organize their work, and then they can create and version things. And to do this, what we've done is come up with a microservice architecture. Every service is purpose-built, so everyone performs a specific function. There's one for just versioning metadata. There's one for versioning files. There's one for holding the way that things are described. And we picked this for the advantages. We could code in any language we want. We could use the cloud native NoSQL databases, and we use a few: document, graph, column oriented, and we use RESTful APIs using JSON, because people want to be able to see the data that's going in and out, and it seemed like a good choice, and we had experience in this in the past. Also, the microservices can talk to each other over HTTP, and that comes in very helpful if you need to grab data that you want that a service is dependent on, instead of going directly to someone's database. And they have to be able to be deployed in containers, because we want to do this in the cloud, and the whole cloud is containers. So this sort of sets up how we decided to set up the microservices. And so for the next slide, in development, these are the basic tenets that we tried to go by. First and foremost, understand what the requirements are. We have a great requirements gathering process that has been refined over time. I think we're in a great place with it now. It took a little while to get there, but I think now we're in a very good place to be able to iterate forward. API first, and that basically means before we write a line of code, the API is set, and the APIs answer the questions that you might ask from the service, like, where's my stuff? I'm looking for Shrek. Where's my Shrek model? And so as long as we know what questions we're answering, we can do that. Effort-based deliveries instead of doing 2-week sprints, and that's so that we could rope different types of things together, since these microservices work together. So if we're working on workflow A, then it's all the things that are going to be required for workflow A, and multiple engineers are working on that. Contract management is very important with the API, and being very strict about that, because the contracts that the APIs have, if they change unexpectedly, and we had this happen early on, if they change unexpectedly, then the clients who are using them will break, which is never good, because then all of a sudden your pipeline grinds to a halt. Let's see, developer cross coverage. We wanted to make sure, because we're using microservices, that we're using common patterns, and that the developers could work on any service, regardless of what state it was in. Also, because we move quickly, high velocity, lots of iteration, and then when we need to, we rethink. And then microservices. That was one of the basic tenets. Here are some of the challenges that we had in developing this. We had a very high demand for read after write consistency. So if someone created something, they wanted to be able to see it almost immediately, and that provided real limited options for caching data at create time. We do have some caching where we can, but there's a lot of volatile data. So after they make that data, they definitely want to read it. Prioritizing feature development. This was kind of a big one. It led to deferred maintenance in the code, which means that we weren't necessarily able to keep up to date on the latest and greatest versions of the libraries that our services were using under the hood. Not a great thing. If you can prioritize some time for maintenance as you go, I would highly recommend it. One thing that we weren't expecting is that cross coverage across services that sort of shrank as the team grew. people became more specialized, and it was really difficult to get everyone that top to bottom view of things. The testing data that we were testing our services, not the same as the data that was being used in production. We did our best guess based on requirements. But when it got to the point where it was being integrated, the services were being integrated, it was a little bit different. We had to make changes based on that. We built a virtual file system to gather files together so that, like Doug said, people could work on things. We could focus on units of work as opposed to individual files. And well, that was not as stable as the Studio NFS filers. It's a lot more stable now than it was when it was in the beginning, which is good. And we continue to iterate on that. This was also a big one. Michael will talk a little bit about this. We had an evolving in-house deployment and database management system. So as we were developing this and getting it onboarded so that people could test it, the deployment system was changing, the database management system was changing, and that impacted how we were doing development. And there were times where we had to stop and make changes to code to satisfy a new way of handling databases, for example. I think one of the things that's happening there is we're trying to have better communication around those types of changes now. Here's a fun one. Database vendors, they changed their long-term support policies on software and driver support. If you're working with any NoSQL database vendor, they drastically, or at least a few that we were working with, they drastically reduced the long-term support policies. And so within 18 months, we were basically out of long-term support. So I'm not sure why, on drivers specifically, so I'm not sure why they call it long-term support. That doesn't feel long-term to me. Let's see, determining why operations were slow. So as people started integrating against the services, we got complaints that things were slow. And sometimes that was because of the way that people were accessing the services. They were making redundant calls, and we had worked with different groups to pare that down. But there were other times where we could have done a better job testing more at scale on our own side. And this falls under the next point of application management. You never know how people are going to use the services. You can only guess. And the greatest source of information is when people start complaining, because then you can go and take a look to see exactly why something's slow. But we had such a division of the integrators versus the API makers on the services that sometimes we couldn't tell why things were slow until we worked directly with them. And then here's the biggest one. In production, the load is significantly higher than expected. And that comes from there were more people that were working on it at the same time. And there was a lot more scale in general based on the previous iterations on our test show that we were doing. And so that was kind of a big one. If you're going through this, I would highly recommend working to make sure that the load that you're testing for the load that production is expecting based on the data that production is using. That is the number one takeaway from the slowness. Not good. There are also some cloud specific challenges. For example, we had no way of testing off-prem until recently. Everything was done at Glendale, and we had to simulate being in a cloud environment. Services had issues that they didn't have on-prem, and that really slowed down the development team and the infrastructure team. Developers didn't have the access they needed. Deployments could take up to 30 minutes and then fail. And then there were networking issues we had in the cloud that were different than they were on-prem. We were using a load balancer that was meant for HTTP traffic, and it kept dropping connections. And we didn't have good enough communication between the infrastructure team and the platform team to understand what was going on. And it actually took us sticking a couple of people in a room together, virtual room together to work that out, figure out what was going on. And that I'd say that's a plus. wouldn't say that was a challenge. I would say that is a solution to a challenge. So that's a lot of stuff that didn't go the way that we thought it did. But there are good things. There were some good things that happened. Here's what went well. The requirements gathering, the API first approach. This is sort of a graph of the number of microservices that we released and over time, and it goes all the way to 2022. These are all the releases that we made, starting from the beginning of time moving forward. And you can see it gets fairly busy at times. And that high velocity development that we were trying to get to, it worked out really well. Microservices worked out really well. Communication between the teams improved as a result of the things that went wrong, and I consider that like I said, a big plus. Yeah, we were able to iterate. I don't know why I wrote high level support there, but oh, that's what it was. We had high level support. We had support from leadership above us to help us get through this. I think that's probably the most important thing out of all of this, is that management has the same vision that you have going forward. I don't think anyone can move this forward in a vacuum, and I think it takes a lot of people to be able to get this going. But one of the most important is having support from management. And that being said, we got lots of stuff to do. These diagrams represent the service infrastructure as it is today, where it's kind of everything's working together, but we want a better view of things, and that's what this circular graph is for, so that we can have better monitoring. Some of the things we're going to be working on, but we are working on, the middle of working on, we want to improve hotspot detection based on production activity, because otherwise we end up giving a bad experience to the artists, which is something you never want to do, because our files are distributed and we don't blindly replicate across all regions, because that could get very, very expensive. We need to find ways to optimize the on-demand file relocation. So if you're in Europe and you need files from here in Glendale, we want to make sure that that is the smoothest and fastest thing that it can be. The deployment system still requires a platform engineer to indicate when things go wrong on deployments, and we are also working on that. Generators, like I said, production-like data is very important, and being able to create generators for that data is critical to success, because you want to be able to test at least as close to the shape of the data that production is using. One thing that we did originally was to have one database instance per service. That goes along with having the data isolation, but we're looking at reducing that. So we will still have data isolation, but we'll get DB consolidation, so we have fewer instances for people to have to manage. That's a big one that's coming up. Still data isolation. Thank you for pointing at that, Doug. We're still working on getting developer access to the cloud, because when this goes on production, we need to make sure that the developers and the infrastructure and engineers have the tools that they need to be able to debug things. We've started working more closely with the tools developers who are integrating against the services, which is great, because we get to find out during the middle of development instead of when things go into production and they say, hey, this is slow. And we go, hey, let's look at that. We can get that done sooner rather than later. Again, a plus. And then Michael's going to touch on this in his presentation, but setting up a show is a Herculean task right now because of all the configuration that needs to happen. So we want to reduce all of the manual overhead for the developers, the platform engineers, when we have to stand up a new show and deploy services. Doug, how am I doing on time?
You're doing good. You're right at time. So.
All right. Well, thank you for your time. Michael?
You're spot on. Thank you. Hi, folks. I'm Michael Ferguson. I work as a senior software engineer here at DreamWorks Animation. I've been working in the kind of platform infrastructure automation space for the past 4 or 5 years now. So going to kind of set the pipeline code itself aside for a second and look at, given a pipeline of this nature, of this distributed nature, what does it look to really scale that, specifically in a hybrid cloud environment? So, and there's a lot of challenges, as you can imagine, that come with that. So we'll get into these points kind of as we go. I'll touch on them briefly here. Of a few challenges that we have is expectations, right? So as Brad just pointed out, setting up a production stack across multiple Azure regions as well as on-prem and replication is kind of a crazy beast of a task right now, right? So we have high-level people who are like, hey, we have this production coming up, we need to create this show and we need this infrastructure and services stood up. From a high level, can look very simple, right? Stand up some infrastructure, put some services on top of it. Why isn't this ready? In the actuality of it, there's a lot of moving pieces, a lot of manual intervention. It can take a long time. So as we scale out this platform and this pipeline, right, we need to reel in expectations of how fast we can stand things up and work on automation in removing some of this manual intervention that it takes. Just the management of the system as a whole, as this scales into multiple regions and cross cloud can get quite intense, as you would imagine on a support team. And that kind of falls under the support thing too, of how do we have insight into what's out there, what it affects, how scaled out we are, et cetera. So Doug, I think we can get in the next slide here. Brett, how dare you steal my slide? But no, appreciate it. Glad this is getting used. So yeah, like I said, kind of right as I alluded to, life in Glendale when we're on-prem is, I'm going to say, relatively straightforward. It's, as people in the DevOps space know, if any folks out there work in the realm of DevOps, which I'm sure a decent chunk of you do, things are not always super simple, right? Things can get complicated even on-prem. So I'm not going to say things are completely straightforward, but they're manageable in Glendale, right? But what about when we talk about like a truly distributed and keyword hybrid production studio environment, right? When we're scaling our services, our databases, the number of things we're managing, the number of things we need insight into by, let's say, 4 or 5x when we're scaling to these Azure regions, it's bringing complexity in the system. It's bringing multiples of areas of potential failure for this pipeline and for the system, right? So how do we manage that? And a keynote that you'll see at the bottom here is this is expected to be deployed, maintained, and supported by the same exact platform team that was just supporting an on-prem single infrastructure stack, right? So how do we solve this, right? Obviously, we're increasing these people's workload by a multitude of factors. How are we going to solve this? So our solution, 2 of the things we're looking at is automation and insight, right? We've developed a number of in-house tools to help address some of these problems. Here are two examples of A, automation, and B, insight that has been very helpful in our integration and scaling into a hybrid cloud world is a tool we built called DreamWorks Cloud, which I'll get into here in a second, and an insight tool called Health Dashboard. So we can keep going, Doug. I kind of think I touch, more in depth here. So DreamWorks Cloud, right? This is a hybrid cloud management platform. So as anyone in infrastructure knows, there's a lot of underlying technologies and configurations, et cetera, that need to happen when you're setting up infrastructure, platforms, what have you. So we wanted kind of a single pane interface of, hey, look, we want to turn our data center and make sure we really have a private cloud environment on-prem. Secondarily, we want insight into the public cloud, right? Not only insight, but how can we deploy from a single management plane into the private cloud and public cloud here? So this is our solution, right? The single pane view, you can see kind of the leftmost image here, the number of resources we cover. Those expand, there's a ton of resources under there. So VMs, hardware infrastructure, networking, storage concepts, right? This is a single place where people can go and see all those things, provision all those things, et cetera. The center picture is kind of a cool view of a few tools we've developed just to help have insight into what resources we have, right? So this is actually kind of a visualized representation of our on-prem data center and what's currently in use, what's open for use, actually some like cost modeling data in there. And the rightmost image here, you can see like we've stripped out a ton of complexity from these infrastructure tools, right? So instead of a user having to know everything there is to know about Azure and provisioning as well as on-prem tool sets, you're presented with a single nice little form here where you can fill out a few things, create a VM, create a network, et cetera. You're going to get that infrastructure for you. So this is one of our solutions. I kind of get into some challenges that have arisen with this too, but this is kind of, I don't even want to say this is a side note because this is very important. As people know, right, is when you're scaling into the public cloud, costing becomes a huge factor. If you are kind of similar to us, you might have, a deal with a public cloud vendor for your first few years, which is great. They're like, have at it. You have spend credits. In some cases, you might even have spend commitments of, hey, here's the full power of the cloud. Let's scale out. Let's see what we can really do. After a few years, you need to get realistic of, what does longevity in the public cloud look like? How do we scale these costs down? How do we get insight even into how much we're spending? So one of the things we've kind of done here is through this DreamWorks Cloud interface, this hybrid cloud platform, anything that you provision through this platform, we track a cost for, both on-prem and in the public cloud, and you can do grouping and filtering, dig into individual resources, dig into production costs, how much has this production cost us overall in terms of rendering costs, in terms of storage, et cetera. So still, we're kind of thinking a lot about this. There's still a lot of work to do in identifying resources that might be underutilized, notifying the right people about those, and really having intelligence around how we can scale our workflows to be cost effective. Getting into the insight solution of things, right? So things on-prem, like I said, are relatively simple, right? You have an operations team. They can kind of just triage your Kubernetes clusters, et cetera, see what's deployed out there. There's not that much to look at, right? When you're talking about 4 or 5xing your services and databases and scaling in the public cloud, all of a sudden you have the question of what's even deployed out there, right? What are the versions that are deployed? What are the contracts? What dependencies exist out there? And not only service to database dependencies, which matters a lot, it's also what services and databases are affecting certain artist capabilities and workflows and productions, right? So you really need insight into, okay, we have this service deployed. If this thing goes down, what is it affecting? What productions are we affecting? Who as production folk, artists are we affecting, or animators, et cetera? So that's a big question mark. You can see I've kind of lined up on the side here, like, these slides are very question-based because these are the types of things we're thinking when going through this process of scaling. So what's deployed and where is it? How are services performing, right? Are things performing up to our standards? We want SLAs and SLOs in place. If things go down, what does it impact, et cetera? So this was kind of one of our solutions and answers to that is we have a lot of that insight in this in-house tool we built here that we just call the health dashboard. So taking kind of a step back or a step up, if you may, is we built all these underlying automation tools, right? Of, okay, we really need automation to scale. So we have DreamWorks Cloud for infrastructure. As Brett mentioned, we had an in-house database management and deployment system. We have CD stuff to get our services deployed out, both on-prem and public cloud. How can we kind of take those and tie them together and introduce the concept of a production into these underlying automation systems? Because even though you have this lower level automation where you can go in and provision, a VM or a Kubernetes cluster or some networking, really the benefit comes when you tie in the concept of productions and orchestrate all of this together. So one of our recent pushes in solutions and systems here is what we call Showbot. Essentially, right, orchestration on top of automation. So we're really determining and working our way towards, this goes back to cutting down these deployment and setup times for technology stacks, right? Like, how can we get to as closely to click a button as possible to set up an entire show, right? Or maybe a few clicks of the button. How can we introduce the concept of, this is the infrastructure that's needed for the certain show based on these databases and services that need to be deployed. Here's how it's deployed. Here's the Azure concepts like resource groups and subscriptions that you need to provision on top of this stuff. Like I said, there's a lot of moving pieces, right? So how can we kind of tie all this together? So this is our solution in that area. I think we're going to get into some of the challenges here that we've run into. So my life for the past few months, more than a few months probably, there's been a lot of diagrams of what you're seeing on the left here. Like I said, there's a ton of moving pieces here, right? This is just a snapshot of part of our show and technology stack setup for production, the systems that are involved, the outcomes that need to happen, et cetera. So one of the challenges, as you can see, is like, you see these little red lightning bolts. There's still a ton of breakdown areas here. So I'm just gonna check my time real quick too. Okay, we're doing great. So there's still a ton of manual intervention in this process, right? Like I said, we have these kind of underlying low-level automation tools. This is kind of a higher level picture of how can we tie that together into creating a production stack. There's a lot of systems at play here, lots of moving and integrated pieces. So really one of the things you need to be careful of is like a domino effect, right? When you're designing, when you're looking at, a tunnel visioning on a specific area of this problem, really all of it ties together. So decisions that you make in solutioning, even small decisions that you don't think would be that consequential, down the line impact a lot of future solution decisions and how you can implement things and put handcuffs on you in certain ways. So you really need a big picture before you get into this stuff, because it impacts you down the road, obviously. So another issue, and Brett touched on this too, is we're attempting to introduce, with automation, you need some level of standardization, right? And we're attempting to introduce this standardization into a world that's oftentimes not standardized. The nature of our services are, we kind of not let them go totally wild, but like they have their choices, right? We could have at the beginning of our process said, everything's a Spring Boot service, everything is on these 3 database types, and kind of constrained ourselves in that matter. The upside of that, like I said, is standardization, right? The downside is you're forcing solutions into a certain box that might not be the best tool set for itself. And you're kind of handcuffing your service developers in a way to use certain technologies, right? So we're kind of in a middle ground world where we have some standardization in place, but when you're going through and automating these things, how can we introduce the right amount of standardization? For an example, like each and every production stack, you need to ensure that services are communicating with the correct service and database dependencies, right? So how do you set that up? Think service configurations when you have, let's say, 60 odd services produced through multiple Azure region stacks. How are you managing database credentials for all of those services, API keys, where are those stored, how are they configured, et cetera? Like, you need some level of standardization in that process so that you don't lose your mind throughout scaling here. Another big challenge we've had is working in a brownfield environment for some of this stuff, right? You'd be pretty surprised at the lack of out-of-the-box solutions we run into for certain problems. And when we do have out-of-the-box solutions, oftentimes they're assuming you're coming from a greenfield environment, sometimes rightfully so, right? They can't predict every single environment and constraints that you're going to have in your own solution. So it's kind of this balance of what can we introduce, how much disruption can we introduce in this process? And as Doug touched on in the opening, right, there's change is tough. There's little tolerance for disruption, especially when you're talking about your platform and the infrastructure level, because it underpins all of your services, all of your productions. There's very low tolerance here, right? So we're coming from a place of, okay, you need to think about the ideal world and solution, but also how can we balance that with things that are running and not pulling out the rug from stuff and kind of slowly introducing change and improvements into this entire system. Big issue is we're working with an already overloaded platform team, right? There's kind of this conundrum where the more you scale, the more demand you have on your platform teams in terms of support, in terms of what they need to support. However, by that means the more you scale and the more busy your platform team is, the less tolerance for disruption and bandwidth they have for implementing change and automation around this stuff. So I think the lesson learned, which Doug, actually, if you can go to the next slide, I think it's my concluding slide here. Yeah, perfect. So kind of if you take away something from this and all these challenges that we're facing, right, and all these moving pieces and solutioning that needs to happen, is you need to be thinking about your solutioning for platform infrastructure automation work before it's needed. Really, in a lot of ways, if you're scaling first, you're putting the cart in front of the horse, right? You can't do that. Things are going to break down very quickly if you don't have these means of automation in place and you're scaling 4 or 5x in the public cloud across all these regions and expecting your tiny little platform team to manage everything here. So I think that's it for me. I think we're on to Q&A here.
That's right. Let's let me do a let me pop back on. There I am. All right, one more slide and then we'll get to Q&A. So in summary, this was This was different for me. I'll be honest. I love talking nothing more about how awesome everything has gone. And in total, yes, it's gone pretty well. I mean, we're in full scale production on 2 productions with all of the stuff we've talked about. It's a lot of hard work from everyone from TDs that do all the integrations to the development teams that Brett's representing, to the operations teams that Michael's representing. There's a lot of people involved to make it all go. I think I really loved the pipeline conferences sort of ask that we be a little more vulnerable on this time around, and expose a little bit more of, you know, what didn't go well as much as what did go well. And I think it's hugely important. I personally have learned a lot from conferences where honestly some of the best talks are people that get very real with what they're doing behind the scenes. A lot of times politically, that's hard to do. It's even hard for me to do sometimes. But I think it's hugely important as a community that we get more expressive with each other and share some of the mistakes. Again, I harken back to the theme that was sort of we opened with this conference, which was all these amazing things that people have achieved. They're incredible, but they didn't come without hardship. And I just really appreciate all the learnings I got from people kind of sharing what they did so I could step around it. I use solutions that they've created in the absence of having solutions there. And so this is sort of sharing back. We've had some pretty good success, and I want to share some of the vulnerabilities. So again, I want to thank Brad and Michael for kind of helping put a lot of stuff together, and hope that the community got something out of that. Pipelines are hard. I mean, we're all here today because I think we're all equally interested in continuing on and innovating in this space. But I think it's nice for us to kind of talk through, you know, what each and every one of us are doing to kind of assist each other. And I think for other reasons, I think, again, I'm doing this as a way to invite you guys in to talk to us. If there's anything that we talk through where you guys have solved problems in this space, we'd love nothing more to hear from you and to collaborate. All this is in an effort for that. And the timing's perfect for my gardeners to be here. So I may have to mute here. I'm going to segue over to allow some of the Q&A to happen here, because I'm sure there's a lot of questions out there, and I want to let you guys have access to people like Brad and Michael. And with that, I'm gonna have Ryan kind of let the questions fly.
Great. Yeah, there's lots of questions on Whova. So the top voted one, can you go into more detail about the virtual file system you developed? Is it Symlink based on top of NFS, or do you also try to improve data access like for heavy caches?
Do you want to take that, Brad?
Sure. Can I say what we're using, Doug?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, so we're using a fuse-based proxy that actually goes back to our regular filers, and it's a pass-through proxy for reads. For writes, there was a little service work done on the first write, and we're not using symlinks. We've posited it's the wrong word. We've chosen instead to figure out how to make that read as fast and performant as possible. We have used caches in between the VFS NFS server and the client to speed up so we can cache read-only data, but we wouldn't want to do that with writes, only because any uncoordinated writes that don't go through that obviously could become invalidated.
Yeah, some of the background on that as well is part of the reason we have a virtual file system is because we want to provide sort of almost like a USB stick-like experience, where as an artist, you sit down and you describe the work that you want to do, and the system does some amount of work to bring what it thinks you need towards you, and you have a way to sort of browse and bring in more. And then what you have is a very isolatable space, which is nice to be able to do revisions without immediately affecting everybody else. And you can sort of push change into the ecosystem. Reason it had to be VFS is because as much as we ideally would like to present this sort of workspace concept to sort of stream magically in and out of applications, there's so many applications that speak POSIX and WinFS native. And we are not in a position yet to create plugins so that it doesn't require that sort of traditional file system underneath it. Ideally, that's the world we would move towards, but that's why we have the VFS in place.
That flows kind of nicely into the next question, which is, can you talk more about the challenges on abstracting NFS from artists and in various DCCs? And what has the feedback been from artists? Do they like moving to that more task-based system?
I'm gonna let Doug take the last part of that question.
Sure. It's been a challenge. It's funny, when we started, a lot of even the people working on the system themselves were insistent that it has to be very POSIX-y. We cannot get rid of the file system. So it's what people know and interact with. And so we did a lot of work in the virtual file system to make it look like a normal traditional hierarchical file system. Ironically, as the developers moved on, we found more and more of them writing the plugin experiences, asking the APIs for information and the content, as opposed to sourcing it straight off the POSIX reference, which is kind of interesting because we did so much work to try to make every query answerable by the raw file system, only to see that most people found it way more convenient to ask the question of our workspace agent, which basically is an abstraction over POSIX. It didn't ask directly to POSIX at all. It gave them every answer from the databases directly. So that's what we saw as an arch from the integrators. As now the artists are intersecting, we're seeing the same anomaly. The artists are missing the file system, the immediacy of seeing everything everywhere, and feeling somewhat constrained by it. But I strongly believe over time we're going to see that same progression of want to get at things through less sort of traditional pipeline-y ways. As evidence of this, I'll cite, I've seen this in music, in movies, where we've seen the evolution of like where I would CD around for MP3 files. And then suddenly now I don't ever think about that. I am always metadata searching things. I think it's an evolutionary step that we're going to go towards, but I won't lie and say artists just love the idea of not having POSIX. I think it's terrifying in the beginning, but I think you'll start to see the evolution and we'll start to enjoy the benefits of what we've set up over time, but it's not immediate. I won't lie.
Cool. So the next question, when you talk about requirements gathering worked well, do you have more details on the process and what kind of worked well, or when did the process not work well?
I'm going to take that. So it worked well when everyone was on the same page and everyone was open and upfront about what they actually wanted. It never worked well when someone came and said, do this because we need this. We worked together with the integrators to come up with the requirements for the services because they are the ones who are interfacing with production directly. And what really worked well is where we talked through what was what the artist experience was, what their expectations were, and that way we could get to we could get to sort of a common understanding. And that really helped. That really worked well. What didn't work well is when we were interfacing with a few people who had said to move forward on something after some requirements gathering, but then finding out that not everyone had been included in that process later. And it, it wasn't people weren't trying to cause problems or anything. It was just that I took this out of my slide deck towards the end before we started getting on production. We sacrificed time for getting things done just so we could get things done. And I think the requirements gathering sort of could have been better during that time. But I would say being open and honest about what you're doing, and if you have a broader vision, to share it. The integrators, if you have broader visions, share them, because doing iterative work where you're making one small change as you're dealing with databases and services, a tiny change could be significant. And if you know that you want something up front, just be upfront about it. There's no hiding in this. You're all working on this together. I would say, yeah, for anyone who's going to attempt this, be open, honest about what it is that you actually want. Don't
I think-
have a hidden agenda.
I agree. I think one of the challenges, and this is not to pick on DreamWorks. I've worked at several other studios, Disney, Warner. It was always the same anomaly where somehow R&D and production weren't always 100% aligned. I never understood that. Like, we're all in this together, like Brett said. I had more success at smaller studios because you're all concentrated in a smaller physical space. Sometimes you're having lunch, right? You're all next. When you're in a bigger company like DreamWorks, it gets a lot more challenging. It's just the sheer volume of people. And so getting access to all the respected leads and all the various departments and everything is just much more daunting. I'm not using that as an excuse, because I think one of the worst things you can do is just use that as an excuse to say, well, I guess we don't need to talk to all the leaders here for production. It's just too many people. No, you do. You absolutely do, because you will face in the end the wrath of not having done that. And I've seen that in many of the companies I've worked at. And we face it ourselves. Now, I will say for the PipelineX project, I'm very happy with how much more I saw of groups coming together, production and technologists joining hands in a much more endearing way. And almost we have weekly meetings with the TDs and such to hear the immediate feedback, and we're reactive. I think that's hugely important. Otherwise, these sorts of projects, there's no chance. So, oh, by the way, I'll add in UX. And I know for some of you have seen Cian and some of our other UX engineers, I can't emphasize enough, in our industry, for whatever reason, UX has just not been a thing as much, is now gaining. UX engineering, user experience, it's a dedicated team that basically, whose whole job it is to evaluate what the requirements are and help formulate that up front. That saved us a ton of work. Not just them, but we had a consulting group too from the outside. That's a UX team. Also, again, amazing. Did a lot of interviewing, saved us a lot of engineering mistakes by leading out front and giving us suggestive designs and things like that. So huge fan of UX.
Great. I think that brings us to time. There's still a ton of questions on Whova, so I'll encourage the three of you, if you have some time, to go in there and just you can reply to those questions directly in the interface offline.
Absolutely. And I really hope this was helpful. One of the biggest questions I have back to the community is, did you find this particular presentation to be helpful? And would encourage others to do more of the same.
Personally, I loved it. I thought it was great. So thank you all for your time. Thanks for the presentation.